Okay, I think we'll look to kick off and the others can join us. I missed the best bits probably. So hello everybody and thank you very much for joining us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going. Just to remind you, if you've heard me say it a moment ago, please do edit your display name. We are recording this session and we don't want to include any attendees' names, any personal data. And we have muted you and turned off cameras and we'll keep it that way throughout for the same reason. I do encourage you to add some any questions you have or observations or comments that you want to share. Please use the Q&A feature. That's the only thing that's enabled for this session. So the Q&A feature, which should appear in the menu, either at the base or the top of your screen. We'll come to those questions at the end, if that's okay. And I do have my colleague Tim on hand. If anyone's having any particular technical problems, please pop it in the Q&A. He's going to keep an eye on that throughout the session, because you never really know how these things are going to go, and fingers crossed that it's all okay and that you can all see me and hear me and see the slides, but in case of any problems, please do reach out. And as I say, please do use it for any questions you have or comments, observations throughout the session. Okay, so let's get started. So just a further reminder, please, if you actually have joined, please take a moment to edit your display names. It's your personal data and we don't want to send it where it's not needed. So please edit your display names. We're recording this and we will keep it available on our website in the future. So we want to remove any attendees' names. You're muted and cameras are off to protect that data as well, but please, I encourage you to use the Q&A. So I'm Emma, for those of you that don't know me. I'm the Commissioner for the Office of the Data Protection Authority here in the Bailiwick of Guernsey. Very, very warm welcome to you all for today's session. So the aim of today's session, we want you to go away with a greater awareness of the role that human error plays in data breaches. And please note in big capital letters that we have very deliberately used the words greater awareness here. It really would be impossible to cover this in any detail in under an hour. So today's session is really about raising awareness of the fact that human error plays an enormous role in data breaches. And as a risk factor, it's something you can focus on addressing in a way that works best for your workplace, because once you understand the part that we all play as human beings in areas of risk, we can all respond in a more meaningful and relevant way, and importantly, in a way that will help you mitigate that risk in the future. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to take you through a super quick overview of data protection to very briefly explain some key terms for those of you that this is a new area. Talk about personal data, special category data, controller, processor, processing, and finally, what a data breach actually is. Then we'll run through some key issues and definitions and trends that we have seen. Next, we'll run through a few quick polls to encourage you to think about this issue and recognize activities that may pose a risk to people if human error creeps in. Then we'll look specifically at the challenges around email and human error, and then finish up with addressing any questions that you have sent us via that Q&A feature. Once we've done that, we'll be inviting you to take your newfound enthusiasm, which I hope you will have, and share it with others as part of what we are calling Project Bijou, but a bit more of that later on. So the Data Protection Bailiwick of Guernsey Law 2017 is what we have in force here in the Bailiwick. It follows in the footsteps of the EU's GDPR, which I'm sure you've all heard of. It gives individuals, gives us rights regarding information processed about us. And it places obligations on organisations that process personal data. And frankly, it's very hard to imagine any organisation that doesn't in some way process personal data. So it affects you in both contexts, as an individual, as a citizen of this jurisdiction with rights, but also working in an organisation that has responsibilities. And data protection is all about protecting personal data. What do we mean by personal data? Well, we mean any information relating to an identified or identifiable individual. It includes facts and opinions. And certain types of information called special category data is afforded a much higher level of protection in the law because of the potential risk, potential harms for individuals if something goes wrong. And the list is on the screen here for you. I mean, it's really worth taking a moment to think about whether and in what context your organisation does handle data like this, and especially in areas like human resources, it's likely that you will be. So it's worth noticing that there is an additional layer of protection for this type of information. It's very, very sensitive information, and it's worth understanding that a bit more in the context of your own organisation. The other key terms you need to understand, controller and processor. And one analogy we've got here is a person with a puppet. So the person is the controller. This is normally an organisation, but it can be an individual person, such as a sole trader or a landlord or any other individual who has legal personality. The controller decides the purposes and means of the processing, or the why and the how of how personal data are used. It's very important to note that employees, volunteers, directors of organisations, of controllers, are like the hands or the fingers of the puppet master in this picture. They're almost always going to be part of the controller, apart from in very limited specific circumstances. And the puppet is the processor. So again, processors can be organisations or individuals, such as sole traders. And the key thing is that the controller has outsourced a specific task involving personal data to them. The processor is not part of the controller and does not make decisions about how the personal data are used. They just perform the task as instructed by the controller. It's not shown in the image, but our controller person here could have lots of different puppet processors if they were outsourcing, say, their payroll to one processor, their marketing to another, etc. So anyone a controller is giving a task to that involves the controller's personal data is a processor. The puppet strings are important. They indicate the legal contracts that all controllers and processors must have in place. These contracts must detail the boundaries of their roles in respect of each other and where responsibility sits, and should be clear about responding to and reporting data breaches. As a takeaway point for today, one thing you could do is make sure your organisation clearly identifies controller and processor relationships that you may have, and has written robust agreements in place with all of them. Okay, processing, the term processing. It's very hard to imagine anything isn't captured by processing. So here's just a few examples of the activities of this really a catch-all term. In a nutshell, if you're doing anything with personal data, you are processing it and therefore captured by the definitions and therefore by the compliance requirements of the law. So personal data breach we get into now. It's defined in section 111 of the law, if you're interested to go and look further. And it's defined as any incident that meets the following criteria: a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of, or access to personal data transmitted, stored, or otherwise processed. A bit of a mouthful, the law usually is. So there will likely be a breach whenever any personal data is accidentally lost, corrupted, or disclosed, or if someone accesses it or passes it on without proper authorization to do so, and it's seen or received by someone who should not have been sent it. And one important new aspect of the data protection law we have now in force here is the duty for controllers to report certain personal data breaches to our office, to the ODPA. But organisations are not legally obliged to report any incidents to the ODPA, to our office, that meet the above criteria if the incident is unlikely to result in a risk to the significant interests of any person whose data have been affected by the incident. So what are significant interests? Well, a person's significant interests are defined in our law as any aspect of their life that could be put at risk due to their personal data being breached. And this could include physical safety, reputation, and could extend to placing them at risk of ID theft, of fraud, financial loss of some description, psychological distress, humiliation. This purple squiggly line you can see on the slide is the breach threshold, and it's deliberately wiggly. It can be really difficult and sometimes even inappropriate for organisations themselves to judge whether there is a risk to a person's significant interests. And because of this, the ODPA does encourage reporting, even if there is a doubt about whether it meets the legal threshold. I want to touch on a little bit more about what we do with breach reports in a moment. But you must keep an internal record of all breaches, regardless of risk posed and regardless of whether they are reported to the ODPA. And I would also recommend that you keep a record of near misses, as you call them, however you want to describe them. Organisationally, you can learn a lot from these incidents. So take the time to log everything and take time to review what you are finding in those logs. And we talked earlier about what constitutes a data breach, and that they can be caused by deliberate, unlawful action, system failures, and accidental actions. So talking about human error in this context, we're obviously talking about the latter, the accidental stuff that people do, and human error can creep in for a number of reasons. An individual is overworked, they're rushing, they're complacent, they're distracted, they're interrupted, they're stressed, they're worried about something not work related, they've had an argument with someone. I mean, the list is endless, really. So a broad definition in this context is simply a mistake made by a person, not a machine. Sort of the facepalm moment, and no one is immune from this. No one's immune from human error. And the classic human error that I'm sure every one of us here today and everyone else too has experienced when we've hit that send button on an email and it sails off to the wrong person. I'll touch a bit briefly on that later as well. Yeah, we're all humans, obviously, therefore it's about all of us. It's not about pointing fingers at everybody else. It's about looking at our own behaviour and that of our colleagues to understand better and therefore respond better. And because it's a human thing, it's a global thing. So, and it's interesting to note that back in 2019, the International Data Protection Commissioners Conference brought a resolution to specifically address human error in data breaches. Okay, so now we know what a breach is and we know what human error is. Let's talk about human error versus technology. And to be clear, this is not a fair fight. You can put in place all the latest tech measures, but your weakest link is always going to be the person using that tech to do their job. So I've alluded to the human versus tech not being a very fair fight, but I wanted to know from you how big a problem you think human error is. So we're going to do a quick poll in a second. And what I want to ask you is, as we talked about before, personal data breaches are reported to us. So what percentage of breaches reported to us do you think are the result of human error? And you'll be given the following options: 100%, around 80, around 60, around 40, around 20, or less than 10%. So if you can please vote now as to what percentage you think breaches reported to us are the result of human error. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to cast your votes on that. So percentage of breaches reported to the ODPA you think are the result of human error. My colleague Tim will close the poll in a couple of seconds. If you can make sure you voted, that will be really useful. Thanks, Tim, if you can close that poll. And if you can show us the results. Wow, you guys are good. Okay, so if we can close that poll. So majority is at 80%. So I'm now going to, thanks, Tim, if you can stop sharing that. I'm now going to show you what the actual stats are. So for those of you who answered 80%, the majority of you, well done. You're right, you're absolutely right. We categorize breaches reported to us. We currently use 9 different categories, and they're constantly under review. These categories are things like human error, cyber incidents, criminal activity, or system error where technology has failed, etc. We looked at a selection of just over 500 breaches reported to us, and we found that in 84% of cases, human error was the cause. The remaining 16 were mainly caused by deliberate criminal activity, such as hacking, and genuine system error was found, interestingly, to represent less than 0.5% of the total. It doesn't even appear on this chart. It's a weeny amount. And that's what you would expect, really. I mean, systems malfunctioning in a way that puts personal data at risk is an incredibly rare event these days. So here we can start to see the evidence of what the cartoon from the previous slide was alluding to. And what we want you to take away from this is human error poses by far and away the biggest risk to keeping people's data safe. But what that also means is that we have a big opportunity to make a really positive impact on it. And we often focus on the technology, and yes, you do need to focus on it a lot. You need experts around you to provide you with effective, efficient, safe, and secure hardware and software. But you also really, really need to focus on people. So we're going to do a series of quickfire polls now to get you thinking about what types of activities could pose a risk to people. And I've got some scenarios of things you might do with people's data. We're going to very quickly run through each one. And I want you to vote whether you think it's low, medium, or high risk to a person if human error were to creep in whilst you're performing these activities. Now, clearly you don't have any information to go. You just are faced with this one sentence to make your decision on this. So the first question put to you, what sort of risk, if you're processing a change of address request for an individual, do you think that there is a low, medium, or high risk to the person whose data you're using if human error were to creep in whilst you're doing this task? And I'm going to ask Tim to send the polls through now to you, so hopefully you should see that on your screen. If you can let me know via the voting buttons whether you think processing a change of address request would lead to a high, medium, or low risk to the individual or individuals concerned. I'll just give you a couple of seconds to vote on that. Okay, a couple more seconds, and then if I can ask Tim to kindly close the poll and share the results with us. Okay, so that's interesting. So pretty evenly spread, but the majority consider that it's a medium risk. Okay, thanks, Tim, if you can close that poll. Okay. Reminder for a car service appointment. So you'll be presented with the same poll in a second. Would there be a low, medium, or high risk to the person whose data you're using if human error were to creep in whilst you're doing this task, the task of a reminder for a car service appointment? If you can vote whether you think it's high, medium, or low risk now, please. So a car service appointment, what sort of risk to the individual whose data it is? A couple more seconds. And Tim, if you can close that now, please, and share the results. Okay, so that's interesting. So most of you think that would be a low risk to the individual, a few medium and a few high. I mean, this is one of the disadvantages of a virtual event. So it would be great to explore some of these in person and chat them through. This will come on to the importance of context in a minute, but this just highlights it. So thanks, Tim, for that. So we'll close that. Okay. Okay, emailing a newsletter from a shoe shop. So you're processing data to send a newsletter out from a shoe shop. Do you think, if Tim can have that poll up, please, there will be low, medium, or high risk to the person or the people whose data you're using if there's human error creeps in? So shoe shop newsletter, low, medium, or high risk to the individuals concerned. You can cast your vote now. A couple of seconds. And if you can close that off now, please, Tim, thank you. And share the results. Pretty similar to the previous poll as well. So the vast majority of you think that would be a low risk to the individual. Thanks, Tim, if you can close that. Okay, right, it's still a newsletter, but this time it's about sexual health. So it's sexual health clinic, for example. Does this change? So we swapped out shoe shop for sexual health processing activity, same activity, just a newsletter, but very different context. How does that impact the assessment of risk for people you're sending newsletters to? If something goes wrong, what's the impact likely to be? Do you think it's low, medium, or high risk for the individuals whose data you are processing? Okay, a couple more seconds on that one. And if you can close that off, please, Tim, and share the results with us. Yeah, so as expected, most of you going for high. Interestingly, a few medium and low. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Tim, if you can close that. Okay. So the point of that, and sadly we don't have the time to, or the opportunity, not being face to face, to explore some of those issues more deeply, which we would do if we were in person. But the point of that exercise is that determining risk is really it's highly subjective and entirely contextual. Something that may seem low risk to you might be very high risk to the individual concerned. But maybe you haven't considered other factors, or you don't have sufficient context to determine that, or you don't have all the details around the individual or the impact that it may have. And it strikes me that empathy is not really a word we hear much in discussions around data protection, but it really is important if we are not treating this as a clinical tick box exercise, but rather working to understand that the things we do have real impacts on real people, and we need to understand that better. So hence why organisations processing the data may not really be able to accurately or effectively determine whether there is a genuinely high risk or not. So have a think about how you can better recognise high risk data processing activities in your own workplace, mindful of the wider context that may be at play for that individual or the individuals concerned, and mindful of the possible or likely impact to those individuals should their data be compromised in that context. How can you support your colleagues or staff members so that they are calm, careful and considered while they're performing those sorts of processing activities and handling that sort of data? And think about other ways that you might mitigate the human error risk during these activities. And also think hard about who in your organisation is charged with making those decisions about determining risk. Are they the right person? Is there appropriate support and training to help support good decision making? And is there governance of how they are making those decisions? So what can we do about all this risk and human error? Well, firstly, we must acknowledge it, and I mean properly acknowledge it. Then we can work to understand the particular area of risk which your own organisation may face. And just take a moment to consider our relationship with email. We know that one of the riskiest points for organisations and the data it looks after is the point at which that data leave the organisation. So a letter being sent, a courier document going to a client, something being emailed. We don't need to tell you that emailing personal data to the wrong person or the sender not noticing or selecting the wrong person from a list of recipients is incredibly common. We see it every week in the breach reports that we receive. So you may think we can solve this by simply turning off the autofill feature. And I've seen that recommended by some people. So easy, right? So human error sorted. Not quite. Like we said earlier, there are no easy solutions when it comes to human error, especially when human error is knocking up against technology. So if you eliminate autocomplete, but there is still a human being operating the email software, and now with autocomplete off, you're relying on them correctly typing in email addresses 100% of the time. Another option is leaving autocomplete in place, but building in a delay in the email being sent. And this may well pick up errors, but only if the human operator goes back and checks each email they send and correctly picks up any errors that they didn't spot before. Now, this may work some of the time, but this leaves room for complacency to sneak back in after a while. And what if the human is distracted in those 2 minutes immediately following an email error? At the ODPA, we have, since the law came into force in 2018, been very open about the number and nature of data breaches reported to us. It's not a name and shame exercise. It's an exercise in learning, and it's an exercise in improving. Because if we know where the challenges are, if we know where the risks are, we can focus on responding in a direct and specific way. We can all learn from each other and take steps to minimize particular areas of risk. They'll never disappear altogether. Of course they won't, because we are human beings and we are fallible. But equally, there's lots of really positive things we can do to reduce fallibility and, importantly, to learn from it and to make improvements. So what I want to do now is just to see if anyone has any questions. I think I can have a quick look in the Q&A. I'd encourage you to pop them in, or any observations that anyone has. Depends, yes, some context around the poll questions, which is entirely understandable. And that's exactly the message we wanted to give you, is that it does depend on context, and a newsletter in one context can say something completely different about from a newsletter in another context. So yeah, that's a really, really important point. One point I wanted to make, which struck me as I was listening to the news earlier this week, and they were talking about the MPs lobbying row or scandal, depending on your point of view. And we heard a lot that the rules were stuck by, that those people who were accused of doing things that there's an outcry about, that they stuck by the rules and that they complied with the law and they complied with the regulations. And I heard a quote which really resonated with me from a data protection perspective, which is, what we need is good behavior, not just a following of the rules. And so I think that's, again, an important point to make around the whole context of data protection. It sort of goes beyond, I mean, the law is really important, but it goes beyond that. And we can be morally outraged even when people do comply with law. So what we're trying to do is sort of elevate this discussion to be a bit more real, a bit more based in the human, a bit more relevant for us all. And one comment from a previous session on human error was somebody suggested that they, in their organization, something was really useful, something called Confession Fridays, I think they called it, where there was a really open discussion about things that had gone wrong in the organization that week, and they could talk about it and learn from it. So that sense that you're really trusted in a trusted environment to speak openly about when things don't quite go to plan, because then you can start to work at getting things back on track and preventing that from happening in the first place. Okay. Let's talk a bit about some summary points to take away. So be aware of human error and know that nobody is immune from it. We've all done it and we will all do it again. And you'll never eradicate it entirely, but you really can take some positive and constructive steps to reduce it. Pause. What I mean by that is, when there's some especially sensitive processing activity or high risk data activity going on, just take a moment to make sure that you understand the impact if something goes wrong, the impact on the individual, not just your organization reputationally, that matters too, but the impact on the actual person at the other side of that spreadsheet or database. Ask for help if you need it, if you're concerned about the risk or concerned about something going wrong. Be sure to know where to go for help. Some of you may well be the data protection officer for your organisation. If you're not, do you know if your organisation has one? And do you know who that person is and how to contact them? They can be terribly useful in helping support and navigate you through. Train, support and look after your staff, especially in times of stress. And it sounds so obvious, doesn't it? But that's when they're more likely to default to habitual responses that may lead to errors rather than considered reasoning. And so you really do need to factor that in as well. Prime your work environment with reminders for staff to be vigilant. Maybe have a think about some visual reminders that sit around the workplace, around the desktop, notice boards around desks, that sort of thing. Just a gentle and subtle and consistent reminder about this issue. And culture, we hear that word talked about a lot, and it's quite hard to pinpoint, isn't it? But it's really important to have a culture that allows for supportive development and learning when things go wrong. Have each other's backs rather than pointing fingers of blame at individuals that maybe has made an honest mistake. And this will encourage honesty. You know, a breach is bad enough. A breach which a member of staff is too afraid to mention or to raise is much, much worse. You need to know as soon as possible if something's happened to your data, and you then need to ensure a mature and constructive approach when things go wrong. And that will only happen if staff feel confident and feel respected and valued enough to be honest at difficult times like that. So encouraging a work environment that does allow staff sufficient time and space to work in a considered calm and unhurried fashion. And it's easier said than done, of course, I know that we're all under pressure. But especially high-risk activities, make sure that those staff are supported. If you have a DPO, as I say, use them. If you are a DPO, get yourself out there, start talking to staff. How do you engage with this? And how can you maybe support staff and support your organisation a little bit better? What activities can maybe you run to help raise awareness in this and support staff in managing breaches and stuff? Okay, I do want to, forgive me for indulging, but I do want to mention the launch of a social initiative the ODPA are doing in May this year. It's called Project Bijou, and it's aimed at engaging people in the protection of their own and others' data through culture and stories, sort of beyond the sense that it goes beyond law and beyond legal definitions. Emphasizing the very human side of data protection and thinking about culture change and use of examples and stories to demonstrate real data harms, what that actually looks like, and build engagement. But the essence is this: that the project seeks to shift culture, change behavior, reduce harm through effective sharing of information between individuals, between people. And the more we can appreciate and engage with this issue being about ourselves as human beings, our families and our friends and our colleagues, the better we're going to be at delivering on the compliance duties that we all have. If you have a why something matters, then you can better deal with the how you need to deliver on the compliance requirements, the more administrative tasks that you may bulk out or raise your eyes at. If you understand why those matter and what they deliver, it becomes so much easier. And I really do firmly believe the stakes are now too high for us to think that enforcing our way out is the best course of action. I mean, yes, we need enforcement, we need regulatory action where things go wrong. But first and foremost, we need to understand why the protection of our data matters for us as individuals and for our economy. We need to recognise that we need to protect data because that's just the right thing to do. The law backs that up. But first and foremost, it's a cultural as much as a legal thing. So I would encourage you to look up more information on our website. It's had a bit of a revamp in recent months, so I'd encourage you to have a little look. The old website was a bit tired, so we've improved that at no end. So have a little look if you haven't already. Please make a diary note for the week of the 24th of May this year. We're running a week-long virtual event. It moved from an in-person event for obvious reasons, but that has meant that we've got some really fabulous contributors from right across the globe to be involved. So there are benefits to this virtual working environment sometimes. And also, I want to point out a reminder really that we're always working to provide as much support and information to our regulated community in the Bailiwick and our citizens in this area. We're continuing to run our fortnightly drop-in sessions for questions. They're back up and running, which is great. You can also email us, sign up to our newsletter if you haven't already, or check out the future events page on our website to see the further events that we're running for free. So I'd encourage you to have a little bit of a browse of our website when you have time to do so. If you're on LinkedIn, you can follow us there too. We don't do an awful lot of social media activity, but we are on LinkedIn. We post updates about the Bailiwick and our office on there, as well as referencing some relevant global issues around data, which you may be interested in seeing. So I want to leave you with this, that an organisation's use of technology should not be considered in isolation. It should encompass culture, education, and communication. More than anything, it's about well-informed, well-supported and valued people. Human error is a deeply personal issue for us all in every area of our lives. This is the human condition. We are not and will never be perfect. But we have a hope of reducing human error by looking after each other better, being better leaders if you lead people, better colleagues, better friends. And then in turn, that will make us better stewards of the data that people have entrusted us to look after. And I believe very, very firmly that that benefits us as individuals, as citizens. It benefits the companies that we work for and want to flourish, and in turn, the economy. Data is the lifeblood of our world, and the Bailiwick is no different. And if we are trusted as a community, if we're trusted as a jurisdiction, we will absolutely be in a stronger position, both socially and economically. So it's a win-win if we get this right. So I know that's been a bit of a whistle stop, and the time we would normally take to have a little chat, we haven't had to take. And I know these virtual events, which we're all getting more used to, don't offer the rather richer experience of being able to chat before, during and after the events. But I do hope that you've found today of some use and taken something, however small, away. And I do hope you'll take a little bit of time to explore some of the other bits and pieces on our website and sign up maybe for some future events. We do have a feedback form, if you wouldn't mind filling that in, which you'll be given in a second. But I just want to finish by saying a very sincere thank you for joining us. We're delighted with the engagement of our regulated community more broadly across the Bailiwick, and we're extremely grateful for it too. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a very good rest of the day.